In these years, death was not hidden in dark corners, nor whispered of in silence. It was paraded before the eyes of all, set upon the stage of the marketplace, carved into the memory of towns and villages. The scaffold was no simple instrument. It was a theater of power. The whip was not merely leather, but a script written across human flesh. And the condemned man, trembling and broken, was not a victim in private agony, but an actor upon a stage where his torment became the story. To rebel against the crown was not to risk mere defeat in battle. It was to invite a death designed not only to extinguish life, but to magnify suffering, to echo pain into the souls of those who watched. It was to offer one's body as parchment upon which the king's command was written in blood. The square itself became a cathedral of fear. Before the looming stone church, beneath its solemn bells, the people gathered in dense, breathless crowds. Peasants pressed shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale with dread, shivering not only from the chill, but from the knowledge of what they were about to see. Beside them, nobles stood in their silks and furs, faces hard, lips tight, as if convinced that cruelty displayed was order preserved. Priests intoned their psalms, voices rising in cold unison, as though sanctifying the very horror about to unfold. Soldiers forced the rebels forward, their armor gleaming in the weak light, their grip iron upon rope and chain. Every step dragged the condemned deeper into the theater of their undoing. One man was dragged to the whipping post, bound upright as though crucified. The crowd gasped as the executioner raised the lash, and then the square erupted with the crack of leather splitting air and skin alike. His back opened like parchment torn by force, blood springing in bright arcs that caught the morning light. His scream was not his own alone. It was seized by the crowd, pulled into their chests, swallowed and remembered. With each lash, silence fell heavier. Mothers held their children close. Old men bowed their heads, and yet no one turned away. The lash was not meant only for the man bound to the post. It was meant for them all. Another prisoner was forced to kneel upon the cobblestones. Iron rods, heated in coals until they glowed red, were pressed against his skin. The hiss of burning flesh filled the square, sharper than the crack of the whip, sharper even than the scream that followed. His body convulsed, twisting as if trying to escape its own betrayal. The smell rose thick into the air, acrid and suffocating, searing itself into every memory present. And still the priest chanted, voices steady, as though the sanctity of order outweighed the torment of flesh. Finally, the condemned were bound to horses, thick ropes lashed to arms and legs, pulled taut until the rebels stood stretched like figures in some grotesque crucifixion. The horses strained, muscles quivering, hooves striking sparks against the stones. And then, with a whip crack, they surged forward. The prisoners' bodies contorted beyond the measure of bone and sinew, cries bursting forth and echoing against the stone church that towered above. The square fell into a silence more terrible than noise, the silence of breath held, of hearts clenched, of souls recoiling from what no man should see, yet all were made to witness. They called it justice, but it was more than justice. It was theater, spectacle, ritual. It was a lesson written not in ink, but in pain, etched into the air, into the stone of the square, into the hearts of every man, woman, and child who stood there. Pain did not vanish when the bodies fell still. It lingered, hovering above the square, seeping into memory. It dwelled in every gasp that had escaped lips, in every shriek that had pierced the morning, in the heavy silence that followed each convulsion. This was how a king made obedience, not by words spoken in council, not by decrees written on parchment, but by flesh broken, by bones splintered, by cries that echoed longer than sermons. In this age, fear was a currency, and the crown minted it from blood. The people went home carrying that fear like a brand upon their souls, knowing that defiance would not only be punished, it would be displayed. And so obedience was not merely chosen. It was carved, branded, and quartered into the very heart of a kingdom. They dreamed of casting down the conquerors, but in those dreams lay more than fire. There was also shadow creeping along the edges of every vow, whispering that hope and doom often walk hand in hand. For rebellion is not born in sunlight. It grows in corners where the light cannot reach, in chambers lit by fire and secrecy, in the hushed tones of men who know too well that each word they speak could be the one that condemns them. Picture the hall, a great timbered room, walls blackened by smoke, the air thick with the scent of tallow and sweat. A fire burns low, casting long, flickering shadows that turn faces into masks of resolve and doubt. Around the oak table sit the rebels, William FitzOsbern's men, veterans of conquest and restless heirs of a new order they did not choose. Maps lie unfurled before them, the parchment scarred with dagger points, lines drawn in haste, borders redrawn not with diplomacy, but with blood imagined. Each dagger stabbed into the wood is not only a plan, but a declaration, a promise that cannot be withdrawn. Their voices rise and fall in the dimness. They speak of freedom from Norman rule, of casting off the yoke of a conqueror whose iron grip has silenced towns and broken lords. They dream of restoring what was theirs before the banners of Normandy darken the English sky. One swears vengeance for land seized, another for kin slain, and another simply because he cannot bear to bow to a foreign crown. In their words is fury, in their hearts is fire. Yet in their eyes there lies fear, sharp and undeniable. For every oath sworn, that night was a thread spun of both defiance and despair. They knew that to whisper against the crown was to place their necks upon the block, even before a blade had been raised. Still they swore. One by one, hands pressed to dagger hilts, they pledged not only to fight, but to bind their fates together. Oaths made in firelight are heavier than those made in daylight, for they are forged not in hope of applause, but in defiance of silence. But the hall was no sanctuary from doom. Outside its walls, the world remained vast, indifferent, and treacherous. Spies moved in shadows as surely as the rebels plotted in them. The air itself seemed to listen, carrying whispers through cracks in the stone, over rooftops, into ears eager to sell secrets for gold or for life. For every dagger stabbed into parchment, there was an unseen hand waiting to pull it free. And so, beneath the fervor of their plans, unease lingered. Each man looked into the flames and saw not only the victory he longed for, but also the pyre that might consume him. They dreamed of banners raised in triumph, yet heard faintly the toll of the church bell that might one day mark their execution. They pressed their vows into the silence, but the silence answered with a weight heavier than their voices could dispel. This is the paradox of rebellion. It is born of courage, but nourished by desperation. It thrives on faith, but withers beneath betrayal. And though the rebels gathered there believed themselves bound by loyalty and purpose, the truth coiled at their feet like smoke, beautiful, fleeting, and ready to vanish at the slightest breath of treachery. William FitzOsbern's men dreamed boldly. They saw themselves casting down conquerors, reshaping kingdoms, reclaiming what was lost. But even as they swore their oaths, doom had already found them. It lingered in the corners of the hall, in the quiver of a hand as it touched steel, in the flicker of an eye glancing too quickly to the door. It was written in the very maps they marked, for each line traced upon the parchment was not merely a path to victory, it was a record of their conspiracy, a document waiting to betray them. And thus in their whispers lay both defiance and doom. They believed their voices were hidden, that fire and stone walls would guard their secrets. Yet the firelight betrayed their shadows upon the wall, and shadows cannot be silenced. They dreamed of freedom, but freedom in that age was a dream that could cost everything. Every vow spoken was already weighed against the gallows, every oath sworn already measured by the lash and the rope. The shadow of rebellion was not merely around them, it was within them. It clung to their words, coiled around their hearts, and sealed their fate long before swords were drawn. They were men of fire, yes, but also men of ash. And ash, however fiercely it glows, is destined to scatter in the wind. The sword may win battles, but betrayal decides wars. And in that age, betrayal moves swifter than any blade, cutting deeper than steel, striking not at the body but at the heart. For rebellion is fragile. Its strength lies not only in swords raised, but in secrets kept. And when a secret falters, an entire cause crumbles with it. It began in whispers. A messenger seized in the darkness, his cloak torn, his scrolls spilled into the mud. Words meant to ignite an army became evidence placed into the hands of the crown. The rebel cause, once shielded by firelight and oaths, was now laid bare beneath the cold scrutiny of royal eyes. Treachery had pried open their walls long before soldiers reached their gates. When the attack came, it came like a storm without warning. The night was torn by the thunder of hooves and the clamor of steel. Soldiers swarmed the stronghold, their torches blazing against the blackness, each flame a spear of judgment. Shadows leapt along the walls as iron clashed with desperate blades, as cries of loyalty drowned beneath the roar of conquest. The rebels fought, but they fought in despair. Their stronghold, once a sanctuary, had become a cage. Steel rang against steel, sparks flying, torches scattering embers across the straw-strewn ground. Yet with every clash, the truth rang louder than the weapons in their hands. They had been betrayed. No fortress could withstand the weight of treachery. No oath could outlast the whisper of a spy. Dragged from their halls, they were thrown into the mud. Banners that once proclaimed defiance now lay trampled beneath boots, their colors fading into the dirt. Symbols of pride reduced to rags, soaked in rain, crushed by the iron of an enemy who no longer needed to prove his might. Betrayal had already secured his victory. Some rebels pleaded for mercy, but the mud swallowed their words. Others fought until the last breath, but even courage cannot outlive betrayal. Bound in chains, dragged through the filth of their own courtyard, they became prisoners not only of the crown, but of their own broken cause. Each step through the muck was a step into infamy, their once proud rebellion collapsing into memory before their eyes. And so, the truth revealed itself with merciless clarity. The sword may carve wounds, but betrayal decides the end. For when the walls fell, it was not stone that crumbled, but hope. The fire that once burned in secret halls, the oaths sworn over maps and daggers, the dream of casting down the conquerors, all of it dissolved in that night of treachery. The conquerors claimed the stronghold, but it was betrayal that claimed the rebels' souls. Their downfall was not sealed by the clash of arms, but by the quiet hand that opened their gates, by the single whisper that traded loyalty for survival. Wars are not ended by battles alone. They are ended by betrayal, silent and unseen, until the moment it strikes and leaves nothing standing. Thus ended the dream, not in triumph, not even in honorable defeat, but in the mud under the torchlight, where rebellion was crushed not by strength, but by treachery. To confess was agony, to resist was worse, and so their silence was broken bone by bone, scream by scream. The dungeon was no refuge from pain, it was its dwelling place. Beneath the weight of stone, in the damp air that smelled of rot and rust, the rebels were cast into darkness. Iron chains clamped their wrists, biting into flesh already bruised. Water dripped from the ceiling, each drop a metronome to mark their suffering, each echo a reminder that time itself belonged not to them, but to their jailers. The cell was not built merely to contain, it was built to erode, to strip away dignity as surely as shackles stripped away freedom. Faces that had once burned with defiance now hollowed under hunger. Cheeks sank, eyes dulled, lips cracked with thirst. Yet within some, a faint ember of resistance still flickered, fragile but unextinguished. It was that ember the interrogators sought to snuff out, for they knew rebellion does not die at the scaffold. It dies first in the dungeon, when the will is broken before the body follows. And so the questions began, voices sharp, cold, calculated. Who else conspired with you? Where did you plot? Who gave you coin? To answer was betrayal. To refuse was torment. Neither path offered mercy, only the illusion of choice. Threats filled the air, promises of fire, of rope, of the rack. And when threats failed, steel and flame spoke for them. The rack stretched bodies until joints tore, until bone ground against bone. Screams echoed through the corridors, rising like psalms of despair. Torches pressed too close blistered skin, the hiss of burning flesh mingling with gas for breath. The noose dangled in shadow as promise of an ending. Swift perhaps, but earned only through confession that damned not one man but many. Some broke quickly, surrendering names, offering secrets just to taste release from pain. Others resisted longer, holding silence as though it were the last treasure they could claim. Yet even the strongest discovered that silence has a cost greater than words. For each refusal brought the lash, each denial another turn of the rack, another visit of iron upon flesh. And with each blow, silence was chipped away until it crumbled into cries and cries into words. To confess was agony, yes, but to resist was worse, for resistance demanded the sacrifice of body, of sanity, of breath itself. In the end, every man discovered the truth the dungeon had always known, that courage may live in the heart, but the body is a frail vessel, and pain is the language it cannot ignore. Yet even in their torment, fragments of defiance remained. A glance held too long, a whisper spat through bloodied teeth, a refusal to name a friend, though the body trembled on the edge of collapse. These fragments were not victories, but embers, glowing faintly in the dark. And though the crown would crush them, though iron and flame would silence their voices, those fragments endured long enough to remind the jailers that rebellion is not so easily erased. The dungeon was a place of endings, but also of revelations. It revealed the limits of flesh, the cruelty of power, the price of resistance. And as the screams rose and faded, echoing against cold stone, they became a litany of truth, that kingdoms are not held by parchment alone, but by suffering, that obedience is not born in hearts, it is carved into them. Thus the captives learned, bone by bone, scream by scream, that silence itself could be destroyed. And the crown learned too, in each defiant ember that refused to die, that even broken men can cast shadows larger than their chains. They would be made into an example, not slain in shadow, not hidden in the cold secrecy of the dungeon, but torn before the eyes of all, before God, before King, before the people. For power thrives not in silence, but in spectacle. And on this dawn, the crown demanded a spectacle so fierce that memory itself would tremble. The square was already full before the sun had risen. The air was damp with morning mist, the stones slick beneath countless feet. Peasants pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath rising in anxious clouds. Nobles in fur-lined cloaks watched with narrowed eyes, masks of composure concealing unease. Priests gathered at the steps of the church, psalms on their lips but shadows in their gaze. All had come because all were commanded to see. At the center rose the scaffold, black timbers, rough-hewn, towering like a grim altar. Upon it, no holy sacrifice would be laid, but a spectacle fashioned to terrify the living and honor the dead king's decree. Drums began to sound, low and heavy, each strike echoing like the heartbeat of doom. With each beat, the crowd stiffened, waiting. With each beat, the condemned drew closer. The rebels emerged at last, led in chains, pale and trembling from the weeks of torment endured. Their bodies bore the marks of dungeon cruelty, backs scored by whips, faces gaunt with hunger, steps faltering beneath iron shackles. And yet in their eyes there lingered something unbroken. They had been hollowed but not emptied. They had been crushed but not erased. Pale, trembling, yes, but unbowed. The executioners moved with ritual precision. Ropes were tied, horses brought forth, their flanks steaming in the cold air. The condemned were bound, arms and legs stretched wide, as though crucified upon the very square that once bore their voices of defiance. The drums quickened, then fell silent. A breathless hush swept the crowd. Children clutched their mothers, mothers clutched their prayers. Even the priests crossed themselves, as though to ward off the vision they were about to sanctify with their presence. And then it began. The whips cracked and the horses strained. The ropes grew taut, dragging the rebels' bodies into grotesque contortions. Muscles tore, bones groaned, voices broke into cries that pierced the very air. The crowd recoiled, some turning away, some covering their mouths, others transfixed by horror they could not escape. Screams rang out, but so too did silence. The silence of those who could not voice what they felt, the silence of fear, the silence of awe. The square became a theater of cruelty. Every convulsion was a lesson. Every shriek was a command. The crown spoke not through heralds, but through the tearing of flesh, the scattering of blood. And though the people recoiled, they understood. This was not justice, it was warning. It declared to all who watched that rebellion would not simply be crushed. It would be broken, displayed, and remembered in pain. The mothers shielded their children, whispering prayers they scarcely believed. The priests held their crosses higher, as though higher wood might cleanse the horror of the wood below. But no gesture, no prayer, no silence could erase what unfolded. The rebels' bodies convulsed, torn between beasts and ropes, until the square itself seemed to shake with their cries. And yet, even in that ruin, even in that theater of annihilation, something lingered. The rebels did not beg. They did not plead for mercy. They screamed yes, but their screams carried the weight of defiance, the echo of men who had chosen to stand against a conqueror. Their agony became a testament, unwilling but undeniable, that courage can endure even as flesh is undone. Thus the square drowned in both screams and silence, screams of the dying, silence of the living. A silence that weighed heavier than words, heavier even than drums. For in that silence each heart knew the truth. Obedience had been carved into them, but memory had also been carved, and memory cannot be quartered. The crown had triumphed. The rebels were quartered, scattered to the winds, their bodies broken and their cause extinguished upon the scaffold. The square lay stained with the memory of their end, stones darkened by blood, air heavy with the echo of cries that would never fade entirely. The drums had fallen silent, but the silence that replaced them was not peace. It was weight, pressing upon every chest, clinging to every heart. For though the king had claimed victory, memory does not obey decrees. As the camera of history rises, the square shrinks to a blot of crimson shadow, and London stretches outward, gray, trembling, veiled in the morning mist. Towers loom like watchmen over a city subdued by fear. Narrow streets curl into silence, their stones carrying the weight of what had been witnessed. And above it all, the bells toll, slow, solemn, endless. Their sound drifts through alleys and across fields, through hearth and hall alike. Each peal is a reminder that rebellion had been crushed, that obedience had been enforced, that power had spoken in the most terrible of tongues. Yet memory is a defiant thing. It clings where it should fade. It grows where it is forbidden. In taverns thick with smoke, men whispered of what they had seen. They whispered not of justice, but of terror. They spoke of faces pale yet unbowed, of screams that shook the air, of courage displayed even as flesh was torn apart. In these whispers the rebels endured, not as villains, not as criminals, but as men who dared. In the silence of fields, where peasants bent to their toil beneath a gray sky, the memory lingered too. Hands that pushed plows and sowed seed did so with a weight in the chest, a silent knowledge that those who had stood against the crown were gone, yet not forgotten. Mothers hushed their children with warnings, but within those warnings was also a spark, the subtle truth that to resist was possible, even if it was punished. Old men muttered by the fire, voices low, telling of how rebellion had been crushed, and yet in telling, preserving the very thing the crown had tried to erase. For memory is stubborn. It survives chains. It survives fire. It survives the scaffold. The king had scattered their bodies, but he could not scatter the tale of their defiance. He had carved obedience into the flesh of his subjects, but in so doing, he carved a deeper mark into history itself. Their fate was remembered not as order restored, but as defiance punished. It was remembered not as triumph of justice, but as proof of terror. And in that remembering, the rebels gained what they had been denied in life, a place in legend. They became more than men, more than victims. They became a warning in two voices, one spoken by the crown, declaring that rebellion would be destroyed, the other whispered by the people, declaring that rebellion had lived, if only for a moment, and that courage could burn even against impossible odds. Thus their end became a lesson carved not only in flesh, but in history itself. For power may silence voices, but it cannot silence memory. It may shatter bodies, but it cannot shatter the echo they leave behind. The scaffold was torn down, the square washed clean, but the whisper endured. A whisper in taverns, a whisper in fields, a whisper in silence. And whispers, once born, do not die. They travel across time, carried from lip to lip, heart to heart, until they become something greater. A story, a legend, a warning, a truth too sharp to be dulled, too heavy to be lifted, too enduring to be erased.